The station was still half asleep when Darren Caldwell stepped through the frosted glass doors, his breath clouding in the bitter winter air. At 46 years old, with a tall, broad-shouldered frame and a quiet, measured demeanor, Darren blended in easily with the early morning commuters, except for the subtle authority in his gaze that few would recognize. He wore a plain charcoal overcoat, dark scarf, and scuffed leather briefcase that had been with him since his college days. There were no obvious signs that he was the newly appointed CEO of Northeast Rail Lines, one of the largest passenger train networks in the region. This was intentional. Darren had made it his habit, ever since moving into leadership, to ride his company's trains anonymously from time to time. It was the only way to truly understand what passengers experienced, to feel the crowded aisles, hear the announcements, and see how staff handled the unexpected. Today's trip was to be a routine inspection in disguise. The station's grand clock read 6:42 a.m. The platform was busy but not packed. A cluster of office workers in overcoats, a pair of college students dragging rolling bags, and an elderly couple huddled together against the cold. Darren moved with the group toward Track 4, where the sleek silver commuter train sat idling, its windows glowing softly in the dim light. He stepped aboard the middle carriage, finding an empty seat by the window. The air inside was warm, faintly scented with coffee from the dining cart. Darren settled his briefcase on his lap and watched the platform bustle outside. This was the kind of moment he loved, the quiet before the rush, when the train felt like its own small world. A sharp voice broke the calm. "Ticket, please." Darren looked up to see a tall man in a conductor's uniform standing in the aisle. His name badge read R. Whitmore, and he had the squared jaw and clipped tone of someone used to being obeyed. Darren reached into his coat pocket, retrieving a paper ticket he had purchased online the night before. Whitmore took it, glanced down, and immediately frowned. "This ticket's no good," he said flatly. Darren looked at him evenly. "It was purchased through the official site. It's for this train, this route, this time." The conductor shook his head. "This is an off-peak ticket. You're on a peak hour service. You'll have to pay the peak fare or get off at the next stop." His voice was already loud enough that nearby passengers began glancing over. Darren kept his tone calm. "According to the updated fare policy, off-peak tickets purchased in advance are valid during peak hours if seats are available. Your train's less than half full." Whitmore crossed his arms. "Policy is policy. I don't care what you think you read." Something in the man's voice carried a sharp edge, an unspoken dismissal, the kind Darren recognized instantly. He had heard from friends and strangers alike how black men in ordinary clothes were often treated as if they didn't belong in certain spaces. In this moment, despite being the man ultimately responsible for Whitmore's paycheck, he felt that same cool wall go up between them. The conductor held out his hand. "Either pay the extra now, or you'll be stepping off at Eastfield Station." Darren studied him for a long moment, then quietly put his wallet away. "Very well," he said. "I'll get off at Eastfield." Whitmore smirked faintly and moved on to the next passenger. Darren turned back to the window, the cold morning light washing across his reflection. He'd come to see how passengers were treated. This morning, he was getting a painfully clear answer. The train slowed as it pulled into Eastfield Station, its brakes squealing faintly against the steel rails. Darren sat still for a moment, watching the blur of brick buildings and frosted windows outside until the platform came into full view. The morning sun had barely climbed over the horizon, casting a pale gold light that did little to soften the bitter air. When the train stopped, Whitmore appeared again, standing just a few feet away in the aisle. "This is your stop," he said, not bothering to lower his voice. A few passengers glanced up from their phones, curious about the interaction, while others pretended not to notice. Darren rose without a word, slipping the strap of his worn briefcase over his shoulder. As he stepped into the aisle, he could feel the subtle shift in the air, that quiet mix of curiosity and judgment that often lingered in situations like this. He stepped off the train and onto the platform, the cold instantly cutting through his coat. Behind him, the doors slid shut with a mechanical hiss, and the train began to move again, pulling away toward the city with Whitmore still inside. Darren stood still for a moment, watching the silver cars fade into the distance. The rhythmic clatter of wheels on tracks growing softer until it disappeared entirely. Eastfield Station was small, a mid-route stop with a modest waiting room and a vending machine that looked like it hadn't been restocked in weeks. Commuters hurried past him toward the exit, their breath fogging in the air, their eyes fixed on their own destinations. Darren walked slowly toward the bench under the station's timetable board, his mind playing over every second of the confrontation. The refusal, the public dismissal, the smirk. It wasn't the inconvenience that bothered him. He could easily catch the next train or even call for a car. What stung was the way it had been handled. The conductor hadn't checked the actual fare policy, hadn't taken a moment to listen, hadn't even treated him as if his words carried any weight. Darren had seen similar stories in reports from riders, but experiencing it firsthand had a sharper edge. He wondered how many people had been left stranded or humiliated because someone in uniform decided they didn't belong. He sat down on the bench and pulled out his phone, opening the Notes app. The first line he typed was blunt: Conductor Whitmore, train 6:45 a.m., track 4, Eastfield refusal, ticket valid under current policy. Beneath it, he began outlining details of the encounter, careful to note Whitmore's exact words and demeanor. This wasn't about revenge. It was about documentation, about bringing an unfiltered account to the board meeting he had later that morning. As he finished typing, a gust of wind swept down the platform, carrying with it the faint sound of an approaching train horn. Darren glanced at the schedule board. The next city-bound service would arrive in 11 minutes. Plenty of time for him to get where he needed to be, and for Whitmore to unknowingly continue his morning shift, unaware of just how significant his actions had been. Darren closed his phone and leaned back against the bench, the corner of his mouth lifting slightly in a faint, unreadable smile. By the end of the day, the balance of this story would shift, and when it did, it wouldn't be on a cold platform in Eastfield. It would be in a conference room where every decision Whitmore had made would be laid bare, and Darren would be the one telling the story. By the time Darren's second train reached the city's central terminal, the morning rush was in full swing. Streams of commuters flowed through the high-ceilinged concourse, their footsteps echoing against the marble floor, the scent of coffee and warm bagels hanging in the air. Darren moved with practiced ease, weaving through the crowd toward the private elevator tucked away behind a security checkpoint. A guard recognized him immediately and gave a discreet nod, pressing the button without asking for ID. The elevator opened directly into the top floor of the Northeast Rail Line's headquarters, where floor-to-ceiling windows flooded the space with cold winter light. The boardroom was already half full when Darren stepped inside. Executives in tailored suits chatting quietly, department heads scrolling through tablets, and an assistant arranging a stack of printed agendas at the far end of the long table. Darren removed his overcoat, draped it over a chair, and set his worn leather briefcase on the polished surface. The faint hum of the city below filled the brief pause before he spoke. "Good morning," he said simply, his voice carrying enough authority to quiet the room. One of the senior vice presidents, a silver-haired man named Caldwell, no relation, smiled faintly. "Morning, Darren. We're ready whenever you are." Darren nodded once, taking his seat at the head of the table. "Before we start on the quarterly performance review, I'd like to share something from this morning." He opened his briefcase and removed a folded piece of paper, the same off-peak ticket Whitmore had dismissed, and placed it in the center of the table. "I rode the 6:45 a.m. service out of Central Station. Middle carriage, Conductor Whitmore." Several heads turned toward each other at the name, a few eyebrows raising slightly. Darren continued, his tone measured but unyielding. "I purchased this ticket through our own website. According to current fare policy, it is valid on peak hour trains if seating capacity allows. This morning's train was less than half full. Yet I was refused entry past Eastfield Station. The conductor insisted the ticket was invalid, refused to verify policy, and directed me to leave the train in front of other passengers." The director of operations leaned forward, frowning. "He told you to get off? Without checking?" "Yes," Darren said, locking eyes with her. "And I complied, because I wanted to see exactly how it would unfold. I then took the next train in and arrived here on time." He paused, letting the silence stretch. "Now imagine if I had been someone with no flexibility, A worker headed to a job interview, a parent with a child's doctor's appointment, or someone in an emergency situation. That person would have been stranded or humiliated for no reason other than a staff member's refusal to confirm facts. A murmur rippled through the room. The head of customer experience shook her head, jotting something quickly into her notebook. Darren could feel the weight of the moment settling. The realization that this was no hypothetical complaint from an anonymous writer. This was a first-hand account from the CEO himself, and it carried consequences. I don't share this to single out one man for punishment, Darren said finally. I share it because it reflects a failure in our training, our culture, and our accountability. We can't afford to operate in a way that pushes people out instead of bringing them in. We will be reviewing not only this incident, but every instance where our staff have exercised discretion in a way that contradicts policy. He leaned back slightly, his eyes sweeping the room. And this afternoon, I will be meeting with Mr. Whitmore personally. I want him to understand the effect of that decision, not because of who I am, but because of what his job should mean to every passenger who boards our trains. There was no applause, no outward display, just a shared, sharp awareness among the executives that the rest of the day would not follow the original agenda. Darren had come in prepared for a quarterly meeting, but now the company's focus had shifted entirely. And somewhere out there, Robert Whitmore was continuing his shift, unaware that his morning's decision had just made it all the way to the top floor. Robert Whitmore was halfway through his mid-morning run when his radio crackled to life, the dispatcher's voice sharp and businesslike over the static. Conductor Whitmore, please report to headquarters immediately after your current stop at Easton Junction. You're being relieved of duty for the remainder of the day. Repeat. Report to headquarters immediately. He froze for a split second, his hand tightening around the radio. This was not standard procedure. Conductors weren't just pulled off their routes unless something serious had happened. An accident, a major complaint, or a disciplinary issue. His first thought was that maybe a passenger had lodged some ridiculous grievance about fare enforcement. But even then, those matters were usually handled at the end of a shift, not in the middle of one. The rest of the carriage felt suddenly quieter to him, though passengers were still chatting, scrolling on phones or staring out windows. He made his way through the train mechanically, checking tickets but barely glancing at them, his mind stuck on the curt message from dispatch. Every time he thought of it, a faint unease twisted in his stomach. When they pulled into Easton Junction, Whitmore stepped off the train, handed over his log to the relief conductor, and made his way to the staff parking lot. The drive to headquarters felt longer than usual, every red light dragging out the inevitable. His mind kept circling back to the events of the morning, specifically the tall black man in the charcoal overcoat with the worn leather briefcase. Something about that man's composure, the way he didn't argue after being told to leave, had stuck with Whitmore in a way he couldn't quite shake. It hadn't been the usual muttering or pleading he'd gotten from other passengers. There had been something deliberate about it. By the time he reached the headquarters building, his pulse was up, and the palms of his hands were damp against the steering wheel. He parked, straightened his uniform, and walked toward the glass-fronted lobby. The receptionist at the desk barely looked up before pointing him toward the elevator. Top floor. Conference room B. Whitmore hesitated only a moment before stepping inside the elevator, his reflection in the mirrored walls showing a face more tense than he wanted to admit. The ride was short, but each floor indicator felt like another step toward some judgment he wasn't ready for. When the elevator doors opened, he was greeted by a long corridor of polished wood and soft lighting. Conference room B was at the end, its door slightly ajar. Whitmore pushed it open and froze. At the head of the table sat the man from that morning, the same charcoal overcoat now draped neatly over the back of his chair, the same worn briefcase beside him. He was speaking quietly with a group of senior executives, but when Whitmore entered, the conversation stopped. Every head turned in his direction. Mr. Whitmore, the man said, his tone calm but carrying an authority that made the room feel smaller. Please, take a seat. We have something to discuss. Whitmore stepped inside, closing the door behind him, the weight of the moment pressing heavily against his chest. He didn't know yet exactly who this man was, but something deep inside told him that the rest of the day was about to change everything. Whitmore eased into the chair across from Darren, the tension in the room thick enough to cut through. His eyes darted briefly to the faces around the table. The operations director, the head of human resources, two senior vice presidents, all of them seated like silent witnesses to something far larger than a simple fare dispute. The faint hum of the city outside was the only sound, until Darren folded his hands on the table and looked directly at him. "Mr. Whitmore," Darren began, his voice low and steady, "I want to revisit what happened this morning on the 6:45 a.m. service." The way he said it, precise, deliberate, sent a faint pulse of unease through Whitmore's chest. "You checked my ticket, told me it was invalid, refused to verify the fare policy, and directed me to disembark at Eastfield Station." Whitmore cleared his throat, trying to maintain his professional composure. "Sir, I was enforcing the rules as I understood them. The ticket was an off-peak fare, and it was during peak hours." "That's not what the current policy says," Darren replied evenly. "And the policy has been in place since October. It allows pre-purchased off-peak tickets to be honored during peak hours when there is available seating. This morning, the carriage was less than half full. I pointed this out to you. You dismissed it without checking." Whitmore felt heat rising in his face. I may not have remembered that update. We get so many policy changes, which is why it's important to confirm before making a decision that impacts a passenger's journey," Darren cut in, still calm but with a firmness that left no room for debate. He let a pause hang in the air before adding, "Do you know who I am, Mr. Whitmore?" There was something in the tone, not arrogance but inevitability, that made Whitmore's stomach drop. "No, sir," he said carefully. "My name is Darren Caldwell," Darren said, his eyes locked on Whitmore's. "I am the Chief Executive Officer of Northeast Rail Lines. Every train you've worked on for the past 12 years, every route you've walked down, every paycheck you've cashed, it all comes from this company, which I have the privilege and responsibility of leading." The words hit harder than Whitmore expected. His mind scrambled to connect the man in front of him with the polished corporate photos he'd seen in occasional company newsletters. He could see it now, the same eyes, the same quiet confidence, but stripped of the suit and title, Darren had been just another passenger to him that morning. "I didn't recognize you," Whitmore admitted, his voice low, almost defensive. "That's the point," Darren said. "I ride our trains in plain clothes because I want to know how our customers are treated when no one is watching. And what I experienced today was not enforcement of policy. It was dismissal. It was the assumption that you knew better without checking facts. It was an action that could have left someone stranded in the cold for no reason other than your refusal to listen." Whitmore shifted in his chair, the weight of the morning settling heavily on his shoulders. "I didn't mean any disrespect," he said quietly. "Intent matters," Darren replied, "but so does impact. And the impact today was that a paying customer was removed from a valid service without cause. If that had been an elderly passenger, a disabled rider, or someone on their way to a critical appointment, the consequences could have been serious." The room was silent. Darren leaned back slightly, his expression still calm but unreadable. "I'm giving you the opportunity to learn from this, Mr. Whitmore. But you need to understand, the uniform you wear carries more than authority. It carries responsibility, and that responsibility starts with respect." Whitmore nodded once, the knot in his chest tightening. He had been corrected before in his career, but never like this. Never with the unshakable feeling that he had been measured and found lacking, not just as an employee, but as a person entrusted with the public's trust. Darren finally broke eye contact, glancing at the operations director. "We'll discuss next steps after I finish my route review. For now, Mr. Whitmore, you are dismissed to the training department. They'll be expecting you this afternoon." Whitmore stood, the room feeling suddenly too warm. As he reached for the door, he couldn't help but glance back at Darren, who had already turned his attention to the stack of papers before him. There was no gloating, no satisfaction, just the quiet, unmistakable authority of someone who had made his point. And the sting of that point followed Whitmore all the way out into the corridor. The elevator ride down from the top floor felt like it lasted an hour. Whitmore stared at his own reflection in the brushed steel walls. the crisp lines of his uniform suddenly feeling more like a costume than a badge of authority. Each floor that blinked past brought back pieces of the conversation he had just had with Darren. The measured tone, the deliberate pauses, the way he'd spoken not as a man flaunting his position, but as someone who carried the weight of what the company was supposed to stand for. By the time he stepped out into the lobby, the hum of the headquarters felt strange and distant. Employees bustled between offices, tapping on keyboards, holding quiet conversations, completely unaware of the storm turning in his head. He walked through the revolving glass doors into the cold, bracing air of the street, and for the first time in years, the chill didn't just bite at his skin, it cut straight into his thoughts. Whitmore had always prided himself on being efficient. He knew the schedules like the back of his hand, could recite fare codes without checking a book, and often bragged to colleagues about his ability to keep things moving without getting bogged down in arguments. But today's meeting had shown him something he hadn't wanted to see, that efficiency without empathy could be cruelty in disguise. As he walked toward the parking lot, he thought about the man in the charcoal coat. No, not just a man, the CEO, standing on that platform in Eastfield after being told to get off. Whitmore had seen the look in his eyes, the quiet acceptance, and now he wondered how many other passengers had given him that same look over the years, quietly swallowing their frustration because they knew arguing would go nowhere. He remembered an older black woman last winter, bundled in a worn coat, who'd tried to explain that her ticket was valid during a weather delay. He had shut her down quickly, certain he was right. She'd stepped off the train into the snow without another word. At the time, he'd told himself it was just another day on the job. Now he wasn't so sure. The thought settled heavily in his chest. He realized that his authority as a conductor had insulated him from the discomfort of questioning himself. But Darren's words had pierced that insulation in a way nothing else had. It wasn't just about knowing the rules. It was about understanding that every decision had a human cost. By the time Whitmore reached his car, he'd made up his mind. If he was being sent to retraining, he was going to treat it like more than a box to check. He was going to listen, really listen. Not just to the instructors, but to passengers, colleagues, anyone whose experience might show him what his own blind spots had hidden. He slid into the driver's seat and sat there for a moment, gripping the steering wheel. He knew the rest of the day would be uncomfortable, maybe even humiliating. But for the first time in a long while, Whitmore felt something stir under the layers of routine and pride, the faint but unmistakable urge to change. 2 weeks later, Whitmore stood on the same platform at Central Station where the incident had begun. The bitter edge of winter still lingered in the air, but this morning felt different, calmer somehow. He had just completed the retraining program Darren had ordered, a grueling yet eye-opening 2-week deep dive into customer service, policy updates, and perhaps most importantly, empathy training. It wasn't just sitting in a classroom. He'd been shadowing station attendants, helping elderly passengers with luggage, answering confused tourist questions, and even riding in the customer service call center to listen firsthand to the way people's frustrations came through the phone. He had heard stories of missed weddings, lost job interviews, and missed final goodbyes at hospitals, all because someone in his position had chosen to enforce a rule without listening first. Now, as he waited for his next assignment, he was told he would be assisting with the 6:45 a.m. city-bound service, the same train where he had ordered Darren off just days earlier. There was a tightness in his chest as he boarded, walking the aisles to check passengers' tickets. He greeted each person with a small smile, his tone softer than before, asking not just for their ticket, but if they needed help finding their seat or connecting to the Wi-Fi. It felt strange at first, but it was honest. When the train reached Eastfield Station, the doors slid open, and there, stepping onto the carriage, was Darren Caldwell. He wore the same charcoal coat, the same worn leather briefcase in his hand, but this time there was no anonymity. Whitmore felt every eye in the carriage flicker toward the two men as they made eye contact. Darren's expression was neutral, almost unreadable, as he handed over his ticket. Whitmore looked down at it, his mind flashing back to that cold morning. This time, he checked it against the handheld device, confirmed the policy update, and handed it back with a steady voice. "Valid ticket, sir. Welcome aboard." Seat's yours for the whole ride." There was the faintest glimmer of a smile from Darren as he took his seat by the window. The rest of the journey passed quietly until they reached the city terminal. As passengers began to disembark, Darren rose, slinging his briefcase over his shoulder, and paused beside Whitmore. "Looks like you've been busy," Darren said evenly. "Yes, sir," Whitmore replied. "I've learned a lot. More than I thought I needed to." He hesitated, then added, "I'm sorry for how I handled things that day. Not because you're the CEO, but because no passenger should be treated like that." Darren studied him for a moment, then gave a small nod. "That's the right answer. Keep it that way." And with that, Darren stepped off the train into the crowd, his figure merging with the flow of commuters. Whitmore watched him go, feeling an odd sense of relief. The incident that had once been a source of shame now felt like a turning point, not just in his career, but in how he saw the people who boarded his trains. From that day forward, when passengers handed him their tickets, Whitmore didn't just see a piece of paper. He saw a story, a destination, and a responsibility. And he carried that lesson with him on every journey thereafter.